Very good evening, aspirants. Welcome to the Hindu News Analysis by Shankar IAS Academy for the date 13th of July 2021. Today we will be discussing these articles which are based on polity, economics, international relations and geography part of our syllabus. So now let us start our analysis with this first news article. So this first discussion is based on this news article. It mentions about the ongoing excavations at Mailadumparai in Krishnagiri district of Tamil Nadu. And the news is about a megalithic cyst burial monument in Tamil Nadu where a full-length sword with handle has been discovered. And this is the first time where a full-length sword with handle has been discovered. So in this context, let us discuss in brief about the megalithic culture in India. See, the excavations in Tamil Nadu have testified the existence of Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic and Iron Age cultures. And the Paleolithic culture was revealed from the excavations carried out at Attirampakam in Tamil Nadu. And during Microlithic age, there was extensive use of microlithic tools for fishing. And because of that, several microlithic tools were recovered from the excavations at Tirunelveli, Mailadumparai, etc., which are situated in Tamil Nadu. And even the remains of Neolithic and Iron Age periods were discovered from Dharmaburi, Vellore and Tiruvannamalai regions of Tamil Nadu. So these are some of the important regions in Tamil Nadu where tools and remains belonging to different cultures were found. Just take note of this. But our today's focus will be on Indian megalithic culture. First, we need to know about megalith. A megalith is a stone which is larger in size and it has been used to construct a monument or a structure. The monument or the structure has been constructed either alone or even together with other stones. And these megalith structures has been used to describe buildings built by people who lived in many different periods from many parts of the world. And the construction of this type of structures took place mainly in the Neolithic period and it even continued into the Chalcolithic age, Bronze Age and Iron Age. So because of this, megaliths are spread across the Indian subcontinent also, and a bulk of them are found in peninsular India. Mainly they are concentrated in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra. They are also concentrated in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So from exam perspective, you also need to know about the types of megalithic structures. See, the types can be divided into two categories. One is the polylithic type and other one is the monolithic type. In polylithic type, more than one stone is used to make the megalithic structure, and in monolithic type, the structure consists of a single stone, because mono means single and poly means many. Now important polylithic types are dolmen, cairn, cromlech and cyst. For example, if you take dolmen, it is made in single chamber tomb and it usually consists of 3 or more upright stones supporting a larger flat horizontal capstone, as you can see in this image. And these dolmens were usually covered with earth or smaller stones to form a barrow. See, barrow is nothing but an ancient burial mound. But our today's focus is on the cyst, which is also mentioned in the news article, because the full-length sword was found in a cyst burial monument only. See, a cyst was used as encasements for dead bodies. So it would not be uncommon to find several cysts close with each other in the cairn or barrow. See, here cairn means a prehistoric burial mound which is made of stones. And since cyst is used as encasements for the dead bodies, they are found near cairn and barrow. And sometimes in the excavated cysts, ornaments are also found. Now, when there is presence of ornaments within an excavated cyst, it indicates the wealth or prominence of the interred individual. So this was the polylithic type. Next one is the monolithic types. It consists of menhir and stone circle. See, a menhir is a stone monolithic standing vertically, as you can see in this image, and it could also exist as part of a group of similar stones. And a stone circle is a monument of standing stones arranged in a circle and usually dated to megalithic period. And the arrangement of stones may be in a circle or in the form of an ellipse, or sometimes we can also find a setting of 4 stones laid on an arc of a circle. So these are some of the important facts that you need to know about megalithic culture. Now let us move on to the next discussion. This discussion is based on this editorial, which is about a recent Supreme Court verdict. See, earlier this week, Supreme Court of India had passed a verdict that can potentially wield more power on the NCR government, that is the Delhi government. And it is expected that this verdict will have bearing not just on NCR legislature, but on any legislature in our country. So in this regard, to understand the issue, let us first see about the governance of Delhi, and then we'll see about the issue on which the verdict has been given. The syllabus relevant to this discussion is given here for your reference. So first, let us begin with knowing how our capital is being administered. See, our capital, that is New Delhi, is a small region which is sandwiched between Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. But the NCT Delhi, or the National Capital Territory of Delhi, it covers an area of 1,500 square kilometers, and it includes parts of the neighboring states of Haryana, Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan. And this is a wider area. See, after independence, the States Reorganization Act of 1956 created the Union Territory of Delhi. And when it was created, it was governed by a lieutenant governor. And here the lieutenant governor acted on the advice of the central government. And she was answerable to the President of India. Then in the year 1966, the Delhi Administration Act was enacted, which brought the Delhi Metropolitan Council into existence. See, this Metropolitan Council of Delhi consisted of 56 elected members and 5 nominated members, and this council was headed by the Lieutenant Governor. But this council had no legislative powers, but it played only an advisory role in the government of Delhi. And then in the year 1991, the Constitution 69th Amendment Act was enacted, and this amendment inserted Articles 239A and 239AB to the Constitution. And after this amendment, the advisory Delhi Metropolitan Council was replaced by a full-fledged legislative assembly, and then Delhi became a special union territory. So from then on, it came to be known as the National Capital Territory of Delhi. But here, one main aspect remained unchanged. It was the role of the Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor remained with huge powers vested on her. If you recollect, she is appointed by the President on the advice of the Centre. So as a result of this, Delhi's elected legislative assembly and its chief minister ended up needing the approval of Lieutenant Governor to perform certain administrative functions like transferring bureaucrats, passing laws, etc. Apart from this, 3 subjects were retained with the Centre. These 3 subjects are land, law and order, and third one is police. These were retained in Centre's control. So based on the constitutional provisions, the Delhi government has no control over the city's 3 primary bodies, which are based on these 3 subjects, and these bodies fall under the reserved subjects list. These 3 bodies are, first one is the Delhi Development Authority. This authority is responsible for housing, infrastructure and commercial and leisure facilities. Second one is the Delhi Police. It has been designated under the Union Ministry of Home Affairs. And the third one is the Trifurcated Municipal Corporation of Delhi. It is an autonomous body that provides civic services to the north, south and east divisions of the city. So these were the subjects and areas and the bodies on which the Delhi government has no control. But on the other hand, Delhi government has complete control over the Public Works Department, Delhi Jal Board, that is the Delhi Water Board, then State Ministry of Power of Delhi. Then it has complete control over health and sanitation subjects and also on the transportation and education subject. So here we can see the power distribution between the Delhi government and the central government. And because of this, the National Capital Region is a fertile ground for power struggle between the central government and the NCR government. And because of the special status of Delhi, the Lieutenant Governor was exercising more power compared to any other governors across India. But this excessive power was kind of doused or extinguished by the Supreme Court judgment in the year 2018. In that judgment, Supreme Court effectively reduced the powers of Lieutenant Governor to that of any state governors. That is, it was made similar to the powers of other state governors. Or we can say that the Lieutenant Governor was made to act on the advice of elected government like other state governors. But there is an exception to this also. That is, the Lieutenant Governor should act on the advice of the elected government except on the 3 reserved subjects of police, public order and land. In these 3 subjects, Lieutenant Governor has discretion. So this is the basic administrative structure of Delhi. So with this knowledge, let us understand the editorial better. See, the issue started when the Committee of Delhi Assembly summoned a senior official of Facebook. You may recollect the horrendous riots of last year that happened throughout Delhi. So as a result of these riots, the committee summoned the senior official of Facebook for spreading fake news and thereby triggering the widespread violence in Delhi. But the social media platform resisted these summons on 3 grounds. Now these grounds were, first was that Facebook argued that it is beyond the powers of legislature of Delhi. And second, it argued that the IT Act is a central law and therefore the Delhi legislature has no jurisdiction over the subject. And thirdly, it argued that law and order is a subject of center and Delhi legislature has no jurisdiction over it. So these were the three grounds based on which Facebook registered the summons by the Committee of Delhi Assembly. As a result of this, a case was filed, and on this case only now the Supreme Court has delivered its verdict. This verdict was delivered last week and it upheld the authority of a committee of Delhi Assembly to summon the senior official of Facebook. And while noting this, Supreme Court has laid down that the Legislative Assembly not only performs the functions of legislating, but it also has inquisitorial and recommendatory powers. See, when we say inquisitorial powers, it means the examining powers. So by this, Supreme Court has emphasized that the inquisitorial and recommendatory powers of a house can be used for better governance. And this verdict has two important implications. One implication is that the verdict has come at a time when the power struggle is extensive. So this verdict can be seen as an emphasis on the importance of federalism and thereby increasing the emphasis on the importance of elected government at the NCR level. And second implication is that this judgment has come at a time when the social media platforms are fighting other provisions of Information Technology Act. So based on this judgment, the responsibility of social media platforms towards legislatures will only become more heightened, and this verdict also now opens the gates for scrutiny of social media platforms by other states. Here you have to remember that unlike Delhi, other states have significantly more powers with respect to law and order. So in essence, we can say that the scrutiny of social media for frivolous and mischievous news could be increased along with the involvement of states. That is, it should be made sure that states will also have a say in the scrutiny of these social media. And that is why the editorial article has been titled The Power of Scrutiny. So with this, let us move on to the next discussion. Our next discussion is based on this news article from the business page. It mentions that the National Mineral Development Corporation, that is the NMDC, has cut the prices of iron ore. And this is an indication of falling demand, especially for steel production. But note that these prices are still above the prices in April. So let us take up this opportunity to discuss about iron ores in India. First, let us have a basic understanding about iron ore. See, iron ore is a metallic mineral. They are also called as ferrous ores from which iron is extracted. Now, some of the principal iron ores are given in this table along with the formulas. Please take note of it. And this iron ore is a basic mineral and it is the backbone of industrial development. And fortunately, India has fairly abundant resources of iron ore and therefore India is rich in good quality iron ores. Now, in our country, most of the iron ore found are of three types. They are hematite, magnetite and limonite. In this, hematite ore contains up to 68% of iron. It is red in color and is often referred to as red ore. Then hematite ore is also the most imported industrial iron ore in terms of quantity used. And next is the magnetite ore. It contains up to 60% of iron and it is dark brown to blackish in color. So it is often referred as the black ores. And this magnetite ore has excellent magnetic qualities, especially it is valuable in the electrical industry. But here you should note that the iron content in these two types, that is in magnetite and hematite, is contentious because NCERT says that magnetite has higher concentration of iron, but whereas other reliable resources say the other way around. But after referring to other sources, we can say that magnetite has higher concentration of iron. Now, the third type of ore is the limonite. It has iron content of 35 to 50%. It is yellow in color and it is quite inferior quality ore. Now, since India has large reserves of hematite and magnetite ores, this inferior quality ore like limonite is rarely exploited. You should also remember that some lowest concentration iron is also found in siderite ores and iron pyrites ore. So now let us see about the iron ore distribution in India. Now this graph indicates the distribution. As you can see, Odisha has the largest reserves of iron ore. And in this map, you can see the iron ore belts. The shaded areas are the one we are interested in today. Let us look at these one by one. First one is the Odisha-Jharkhand belt. In Odisha, high-grade hematite ore is found. It is found in Badampahar mines in the Mayurbhanj and Kendujhar districts. And in the adjoining Singhbhum district of Jharkhand, hematite iron ore is mined in Goa and Naumundi. Now next comes the Durg-Bastar Chandrapur belt. It lies in Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra, and in this belt very high grade hematites are found in the famous Bailadila range of hills, which is in the Bastar district of Chhattisgarh. The range of hills comprise of about 14 deposits of super high grade hematite iron ore. It has the best physical properties needed for steel making. And also the iron ore from these mines are exported to Japan and South Korea via Visakhapatnam port. Now next is the Ballari, Chitradurga, Chikmagaluru, Tumakuru belt, which is in Karnataka. Now it has the large reserves of iron ore. The Kudremukh mines located in the western Ghats of Karnataka are a 100% export unit. And the Kudremukh deposits are known to be one of the largest ones in the world. And the ore is transported as slurry through a pipeline to a port near Mangaluru. Next important belt is Maharashtra-Goa belt. It includes the state of Goa and Ratnagiri district of Maharashtra. See, even though the ores are not of very high quality here, yet they are efficiently exploited. And the iron ore is exported through the Marmagaon port. So in this discussion, we saw some crucial facts important from exam perspective about the iron ores and their reserves in India. Now let us move on to the next discussion. This discussion is based on these two news articles which talk about the recent ongoing crisis in Cuba. This news article mentions that thousands of protesters have took to the street in Cuba and they are chanting freedom, and they are also calling for their president to step down. And on the other hand, this news article talks about the reaction of Russia and Mexico to this protest. So in this scenario, let us see about the geography and polity of Cuba, and we'll also see what is the background for this protest. The syllabus relevant to this discussion is given here for your reference. See, the ongoing protest is said as the biggest anti-government demonstrations seen by Cuba in recent decades. The reason is that Cuba is experiencing its worst economic crisis, and there has also been a huge surge in coronavirus infections in addition to this economic crisis. It is also experiencing a shortage of basic goods, and the government of Cuba is curbing civil liberties. So, the people of Cuba are frustrated, and now they have finally resorted to protests. So what was the response to these protests? In response to this protest, the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has given a televised speech on Sunday. In this speech, he said that the protesters were sincere, but they are being manipulated by US orchestrated social media campaigns and the mercenaries on the ground. He also warned that further provocations would not be tolerated, and even the response of Russia and Mexico was similar to Mr. Miguel. Russia and Mexico has warned against any outside interference in Cuba. But if we take USA, the present administration led by Mr. Joe Biden has supported the protests and said that US stands with the people of Cuba in their call for freedom. So these are the recent escalations with respect to Cuba. So from exam perspective, now let us see some geographical details about Cuba. Cuba is a country of the West Indies. It is the largest single island of the West Indies archipelago, and it is situated just south of Tropic of Cancer. And this island country is at the intersection of Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. Atlantic Ocean is to its north and east, Gulf of Mexico is to its west, and the Caribbean Sea is to its south. And its nearest neighboring country is Haiti. Haiti is located to the east of Cuba. And note that Cuba is separated from Haiti by the Windward Passage. Then another country which lies near to Cuba is Jamaica. It lies to its south. Then we have the Bahamas archipelago also. It lies to the north of Cuban islands. And another major country which is in the proximity of Cuba is United States. It is just about 150 kilometers to the north of Cuba, and it is across the Straits of Florida. And note that Cuba comprises an archipelago of about 1,600 islands and islets, and these islands form an important segment of the Antilles island chain. The island of Cuba is by far the largest in the Antilles island chain. And coming to its other features, Cuba is a multicultural urban nation. Its major city is Havana, which is also its capital and the commercial hub of the country. Then other important Cuban cities include Santiago, Camagüey, Holguin and Trinidad. All these cities offer a rich legacy of colonial Spanish architecture and history. And if we talk about the ethnic composition, diverse ethnic groups have been settling in Cuba since the time of European contact. And these diverse ethnic groups include Spaniards, Africans, Chinese, Jews and Yucatecan Indians also. All these groups have created a heterogeneous society, and they have superimposed their culture and social characteristics on the early settlers of the island. Also note that Spanish is the principal language of Cuba. Now coming to its history, See, in the year 1492, Cuba was claimed by Christopher Columbus for Spain, and from there itself, it became a Spanish empire, and it was also the most important source of raw sugar for the Spanish empire in the 18th century. And Spain ruled Cuba till 1898. And note that in 1898, Spain was defeated by the United States and Cuban forces in the Spanish-American War. And after that, Cuba gained formal independence. So even though it gained formal independence, it was still overshadowed by the nearby United States of America. But on the New Year's Day of the year 1959, the revolutionary forces led by Fidel Castro overthrew the government of dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro even implemented the Marxist-Leninist principles in Cuba. So naturally, Cuba became economically isolated from its northern neighbor, United States. And after that, Cuba even developed close links to the Soviet Union. However, the collapse of Soviet Union in the early 1990s made the situation terrible in Cuba. And after the Soviet Union collapse, Cuba saw widespread shortages and financial uncertainty also. So, by the early 21st century, Cuba loosened some of its more restrictive economic policies and social policies. But the United States of America continued its decades-long economic embargo, that is, ban against the Fidel Castro regime in Cuba. And this changed only in 2014 when US resumed the diplomatic relations between the two countries, and it even promised to remove the embargo. So things were looking good for Cuba until Mr. Trump became the US president. You should know that Mr. Trump's presidency deterred the resumption of diplomatic relations of USA with Cuba. So Cuba again suffered because of this backtracking of USA. And in addition to all this, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. It made the situation even worse. So people are now protesting in Cuba to get their basic necessities. So let us wait and see whether the current president of Cuba steps down or not, or whether we are going to see another coup in the history of Cuba. So that is all about Cuba and its history. Now let us move on to the next discussion. Our next discussion is based on this news article from the business page. It talks about a recent scheme launched by Reserve Bank of India. The scheme allows the retail investors to open retail direct gilt accounts directly with the RBI. And through these accounts, registered users could get access to primary issuance of government securities. Therefore, it facilitates individual investments in government securities. In this context, let us brush up about government securities, and we'll also see about the scheme and other economic terms mentioned in the news article. The syllabus relevant to this discussion is given here for your reference. First, let us understand what is a government security, or in short, GSEC. A government security is a tradable instrument issued by the central government or the state governments. And such tradable instrument acknowledges the government's debt obligation. In simple terms, these are the debt instruments which are issued by the government to borrow money. Now, these government securities can be short-term or even long-term. And when they are short-term securities, they're usually called as treasury bills. And these treasury bills or the short-term securities have original maturities of less than 1 year. And the second type is the long-term securities, and they are usually called as the government bonds or the dated securities. Now, these long-term securities have an original maturity of 1 year or more. So, if it is less than 1 year, it will be short-term. And if it is 1 year or more, then it is called as long-term securities. Now, in India, the central government issues both these types of securities, that is both long-term and short-term, or in other words, it issues both the treasury bills and also the government bonds or dated securities. But the state governments issue only bonds or the dated securities. That means they only issue the short-term ones. And these are called as the state development loans. Now, one of the important features of a government security is that they practically carry no risk of default because they are issued by the government. And that is why they are called as risk-free gilt-edged instruments. See here, the term gilt-edged is the one which denotes the stocks or securities which are regarded as extremely reliable investments. So now let us briefly see about these securities. First, let us understand about the treasury bills, or in short, the T-bills. As you already saw, they are the short-term debt instruments issued by the Government of India, and they are presently issued in 3 tenors. That is one for 91 days, and then for 182 days, and another for 364 days. Another important feature of a treasury bill is that they are zero coupon securities. See, whenever we say coupon or coupon rate with respect to bonds or securities, it means the annual interest payment or the annual interest rate. And since the treasury bills are zero coupon securities, it means that these are the securities with no coupon payments or with no annual interest payment. And that is why the zero coupon bonds or securities, or in this case the treasury bills, pay no interest. But there is one advantage, that is they are issued at a discount and they are redeemed at the face value at maturity. Let us take an example to understand this. See, for example, there is a 91-day treasury bill and it has a face value of 100 rupees and it may be issued at 97 rupees. That is, here the discount is rupees 3. And this 97 rupees will be called as the issue price and the 100 rupees will be the face value. So what would happen is, this will be redeemed at the face value of rupees 100 and the return to the investors will be the difference between the maturity value or the face value and the issue price. That is, the profit will be the difference between these two values. That is, the profit will be 3 rupees. So even though it doesn't pay any interest, it provides discount and from that we get some profit. Now there is also another short-term instrument of RBI. It is called as the cash management bills. In the year 2010, Government of India in consultation with RBI introduced this new short-term instrument. And the intention here was to meet the temporary mismatches in the cash flow of Government of India. Just remember that these cash management bills have the generic character of treasury bills, but these are issued for maturities less than 91 days. But we saw that treasury bills will be issued in 3 tenors, that is for 182 days and even for 364 days. Let us see about the long-term security of dated government securities. These are the securities which carry a fixed or floating interest rate. This interest is paid on the face value on half-yearly basis, and generally the tenor of dated securities ranges from 5 years to 40 years because they are long-term securities. Now, another common fact that you need to know about government securities is that the Public Debt Office of the RBI is the registry of GSECs. That is, it is the depository of government securities. It deals with the issue, interest payment, and also the repayment of principal at maturity. So, this is the basic. Now, let us come to today's news. The news is about a new scheme of RBI. It is the RBI Retail Direct Scheme. This scheme aims to improve the ease of access by retail investors through online access, and this access will be provided to the government securities market. And this can be both primary and secondary market. Now, some of the highlights of RBI Retail Direct Scheme is that retail investors or individuals will have the facility to open and maintain the Retail Direct Gilt account with the RBI. This Retail Direct Gilt account, or in short RDG account, is the main feature of this scheme. See, when we say gilt account, it means an account which is opened and maintained for holding the government securities. And these accounts are held by an entity or a person permitted by the Reserve Bank of India. And as per this scheme, the RDG account can be opened through an online portal provided for this purpose. And this online portal will also give the registered users the access to primary issuance of government securities, and it will provide the access to NDS OM Web. See here, NDS stands for Negotiated Dealing System, OM stands for Order Matching, and this website is a screen-based electronic anonymous order matching website or system for the secondary market trading in government securities. And this is owned by Reserve Bank of India. So these are some of the points that you need to know about government securities and the new scheme of RBI regarding government securities. Now let us move on to the next discussion. Our next discussion is based on this op-ed article, which is another important topic from the international relations perspective. As the title of this article hints, this article throws light on the domestic conflict that is happening in Ethiopia. So in this context, today we will have a comprehensive analysis on Ethiopia, its geography, political structure, and also about the Ethiopian political crisis mentioned in this article. The syllabus relevant to this discussion has been highlighted here for your reference. First, let us have a brief understanding of the geography and political structure of Ethiopia. See, Ethiopia is a country in the African continent and it is situated in the Horn of Africa, that is the Eastern Africa. Its capital is Addis Ababa and it lies completely within the tropical latitudes. Know that Ethiopia is a landlocked country. It is bounded by Eritrea to the north and Djibouti is to its northeast and Somalia is to its east. And Kenya is situated to its south, and South Sudan and Sudan are to its west. And note that it has one of the most rugged topography in Africa. And this Ethiopian country has a high central plateau with some mountains, and the elevation is generally highest just before the point of descent to the Great Rift Valley. This valley splits the plateau diagonally, as you can see in this picture. And also many rivers cross this plateau, and one of the notable rivers is the Blue Nile. It flows from the Lake Tana. And coming to its economy, know that Ethiopian economy is based on agriculture, and coffee is their major agricultural export crop. Now, apart from this, the country has also got limited reserves of gold, platinum, copper, potash, natural gas and hydropower. And note that Ethiopia's population is highly diverse, and most of its people speak Semitic or Cushitic language. And in fact, there are more than 77 different ethnic groups with their own distinct languages within Ethiopia. And on a holistic perspective, note that Ethiopia is Africa's oldest independent country, and it is the second largest country of Africa in terms of population. And if you ask whether it was ever been colonized, yes, it was colonized by Italy during Mussolini's term, and it was colonized for 5 years. And after that, it has never been colonized. Now, coming to its political structure, so it is a federal republic under the 1994 constitution, and according to its constitution, it has a powerful prime minister as the head of the government, and a nominal president is the head of the state. And it has got bicameral legislature. And the prime minister of this country is designated by the ruling party in the House of People's Representatives, and they also nominate a candidate for the presidency, who is then subject to a vote by both legislative houses. Apart from this, another notable feature in Ethiopia is its local government. The structure of Ethiopia's federal system allows the country's 10 regions a significant amount of autonomy. So these are the 10 regions, and each regional state is headed by a president who is elected by the state council, and the cities are headed by a chairman. So in simple words, these regions have their own parliaments, own security forces, and the right to a referendum for independent rule. So this is the basic political structure of Ethiopia. Now the news is about the Tigray crisis. As you can see in this map, Tigray is the northernmost region of Ethiopia, and the issue is the conflict between the party of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Mr. Abiy Ahmed, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. See, you should note that Tigray region is wealthier than other parts of the country, and more importantly, it has got a well-trained army also. And this Tigray People's Liberation Front, they are fighting for the autonomy of Tigray and also for the reconstitution of Ethiopia on the basis of ethnically autonomous regions. And the issue between the Prime Minister's party and this Liberation Front started when Mr. Abiy Ahmed became the Prime Minister of Ethiopia in 2018. It is because until then, the Tigray officials enjoyed authority over the region, but it was considerably reduced since Mr. Abiy took office. And the ongoing conflict is a result of this battle between the two different political ideologies for supremacy and control in the country. Particularly, this issue began when the Tigray region held local elections and the Ethiopian federal government considered it to be illegal. And this issue further gained seriousness when the Prime Minister ordered troops to counter a Tigray rebel attack that happened on Federal Army barracks. And this attack led to the killing of several civilians. And due to these issues, Ethiopia is being accused by the United Nations and Amnesty International. They are accusing it of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and also resorting to rape and hunger as weapons of war. So the Ethiopian crisis is also gaining significance, and let us hope it doesn't become another Syria. So these are some of the facts that you need to know about Ethiopia and its recent crisis. Now let us move on to the next discussion. Okay, now let us take up this news article. It reports about the incident of deaths caused by lightning. See, the news is that with the emergence of monsoon, there is a rise in lightning-linked deaths. And as per the news article, 68 people were struck by lightning and they died on a single day in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh together. To discuss about a rare topic of lightning, let us see how it is formed. So you all would have seen an electric spark on an electric pole or in a plug socket. Now this lightning is also an electric spark only, but it happens on a huge scale. And this lightning is caused by accumulation of charges in the cloud. Now to understand that, you should remember first about thunderstorms. See, during the development of a thunderstorm, the air currents move upward while the water droplets move downward. And these vigorous movements cause separation of charges. And this forms the basis for lightning. Let us try to understand this in detail. See, lightning initially begins as static charges in the rain cloud. And generally, the winds inside the cloud are very turbulent. So due to this, the water droplets in the bottom part of the cloud are caught in the upward air current. Because we saw that during thunderstorms, the air currents move upward. And these water droplets are lifted to great heights. And usually at such greater heights, the atmosphere is extremely cold, and this results in the freezing of the water droplets, which came from the bottom part. And at the same time, simultaneously, the downward current of air in the cloud, it pushes the ice and the hail down from the top of the cloud. So during this, the ice which is going down meets the water which is coming up. And in this process, the electrons are stripped off. And as a result of this, the cloud contains a negatively charged bottom and a positively charged top. And there is also an accumulation of positive charges near the ground as well. So at this scenario, what happens is, when the magnitude of accumulated charges becomes very large, then the air, which is normally a poor conductor of electricity, is no longer able to resist their flow. See, air is normally a poor conductor of electricity because the atmosphere acts as an insulator between them in the cloud. So ultimately, when the strength of the charge overpowers the insulating properties of the atmosphere, then the negative and positive charges meet. And this results in the production of streaks of bright light and sound, which is what we refer to as lightning. And the process involved is called as electric discharge. So here also remember that the lightning looks for the closest and easiest path to release its charge, and it can occur between two or more clouds or even between the clouds and the earth. And when this happens, at that time, the ones on the ground, that is the human beings' life and property, they are also damaged. So in this regard, the news article mentions certain facts. See, as per Home Ministry's statistics, lightning was consistently cited to be one of the biggest natural disaster-linked killer in India. It is because, according to the most recent statistics from the National Crime Records Bureau, more than 8,000 deaths in India were attributable to the forces of nature, and in that, around 35% of the deaths were reported due to lightning. And among the states, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand and Uttar Pradesh have reported maximum number of victims. So these are some of the points that you need to know about lightning and how it is formed. Now let us move on to the next discussion. Our last discussion for the day is going to be based on this editorial article, which talks about school closures, its consequences, and what should be the way forward. See, yesterday also we saw about school closures and some of its impacts. And today we will have a elaborate discussion with some facts in hand. See, various regions around the world which have been worse hit by the novel coronavirus pandemic than India have kept their schools mostly open. For example, if you take Portugal, France and the Netherlands, they have kept their schools open only. Whereas in India, most schools have been closed since the first national lockdown, even though other businesses have opened after the first, second, third lockdowns. Like how closing of businesses affects the economy, closure of schools also affects the children, and its consequences are immense. Because even prior to the pandemic, there was huge attainment gap across students, especially in higher grades. So prolonged school closures has further widened this gap, which is worrying. And this will push the next generation deeper into poverty. Another consequence is that prolonged school closures will increase the school dropouts. Yesterday we saw that how it affects the female students. See, as per recent estimations, nearly 2/3 of children in rural India may drop out of school due to prolonged school closure. Already, Haryana has reported 42% drop in student enrollment in private schools, and also prolonged school shutdowns has severely set back India's fight against the ills such as child labor and child marriage. Because in this pandemic, both are increasing rapidly. Other than that, due to the shutdown of schools, midday meal schemes have been disrupted across various states. So children are not getting nourishment, and it is feared that because of this disruption, 8 lakh additional children would face underweight and wasting. Wasting means low weight for height. And this happens due to malnourishment. Then other than this, extended school closures is also affecting the mental well-being of our children. Yesterday we saw that children are pushed into anxiety and depression. And this is also the case with well-off urban India and in the developed nations. Because there also extended school closures is having severe impact on children's mental health. For example, in Las Vegas, there was a surge of student suicides due to prolonged school closures. And even United Kingdom has reported a 40% rise in the number of children taking antidepressants. So, since the consequences of school closures are more, the authors of this editorial are suggesting for reopening of schools. But you may ask, what about the risk of COVID-19 infection in children? If the schools are reopened, what if they get infected? See, the risk of COVID-19 for children is much lower than for adults. And this conclusion is based on a study in the US and Europe. This study was among 137 million school-age children. According to this study, COVID-19 is less than half as risky as seasonal influenza in the children's age group. And it is also 20 times less risky than death by unintentional injury. Similarly, a study among the nearly 2 million children in Sweden has found that there was not a single child death due to COVID-19. In other words, school-age children are at a negligibly lower risk from COVID-19 when compared to other threats which we consider normal. So this was the conclusion of the study. And also based on many other studies done in US and Europe, it is observed that COVID-19 spread in schools is minimal compared to other locations. And that is why authors are suggesting for reopening of schools. We can see that we have reopened businesses, we have reopened religious places. So why can't we reopen our schools? Children are suffering due to the closure of schools. So based on the studies, it seems worthy to reopen schools. See, one of the reasons behind non-reopening of schools, as said by many governments, including the Indian government, is the lack of vaccination. See, we cannot wait for vaccination of children to reopen school because COVID-19 vaccination in children is still in the trial phase. We must know the complete risk-benefit analysis before vaccinating children, and it may take a longer time to get an effective vaccine that will have minimal side effects on the children. And then only vaccination in children can begin. Otherwise, it will create long-term damages only. So as a conclusion, we can say that instead of relying on vaccines for children, our government should seriously consider reopening schools and safeguard the future generation. So these are some of the points that you can take note from this editorial article. Now let us move on to the next discussion, which is the practice questions discussion. So let us take this first question. It asks, with reference to ancient India, the terms dolmen, cromlech and menhir refers to option A, taxation during Gupta period. Option B, megalithic structures. Option C, irrigation system during Maurya period. Option D, trade-related terms during Indus Valley civilization. And the correct answer is option B, megalithic structures. We saw about dolmen menhir during our discussion. Now let us take this next question. It is a 3-statement question. First statement is, lightning begins as static charges in a rain cloud. This statement is correct. It starts as static charges in a rain cloud which is generally filled with turbulent winds. Statement 2, lightning looks for the closest and easiest path to release its charge. This statement is also correct. We saw this during discussion. Statement 3, we see the lightning before we hear the thunder. This statement is also correct because light travels much faster than sound waves, and that is why we could see lightning before we hear the thunder. See, in this question, you can easily arrive at the correct answer even without knowing many facts, because here the question asks for the incorrect statements. But if you know that the statement 3 is correct because it is based on a basic science principle, which is light travels much faster than sound waves. If you know this fact for sure, you can easily say statement 3 is correct. But here the question asks for the incorrect statements. That means 3 should not be in the answer. But option A, B and C all have 3, and that is why the correct answer is none of the above. That is, none of the above statements are incorrect, or in other words, all of these statements are correct. So this is another way to arrive at the correct answer. Now this next question is based on retail direct scheme of Reserve Bank of India. First statement, it aims to provide online access to retail investors to the primary and secondary government securities market. Statement 2, under this scheme, individuals can maintain a retail direct gilt account with RBI. Both the statements are correct. We saw a detailed discussion about GSEC and also about the scheme, and here the question asks for the correct statements only. So the correct answer is option C, both 1 and 2. Now this next question asks, which of the following are iron ores? Magnetite, hematite, bauxite, cuprites, limonite. And from the discussion, you can easily say that 1, 2 and 5 are iron ores. So they should be in answer, and only one option has 1, 2 and 5, which is option A. And here note that bauxite is a aluminium ore and cuprite is a copper ore. So the correct answer is option A. Now let us take this next question. It is a map based question. It asks, which among the following is a landlocked country? Option A, Eritrea. Option B, Ethiopia. Option C, Egypt. Option D, Kenya. See, all of these countries are in the African continent. 3 of these are in the eastern part of Africa, and Egypt is in the northern part. See, Kenya borders the Indian Ocean. And if you take Egypt, it borders the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. In the last few days, we saw about the Suez Canal, which is managed by the Egypt government. So you should know this fact that Egypt is not a landlocked country. And if you take Eritrea, it also borders the Red Sea. So the correct answer is option B, Ethiopia, which borders Eritrea and Kenya, and also Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia. Now let us take two mains questions. You have to answer these questions. You can answer these questions and post the answers in the comment section for peer review. So we have come to the end of today's Hindu news analysis and the practice questions discussion session. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment and share, and do subscribe to Shankar IAS Academy YouTube channel for more updates related to civil service examination preparation.